is very familiar with his mother's voice. So with all the bustle of the traffic, it's easy to not listen. The man is very familiar with his wife's voice, and in that moment of rage, it sounds nagging and annoying, and it's easy to not listen. And that old preacher is the most boring speaker on the face of the earth. And it's so easy to not pay attention when he's preaching. Wisdom didn't come in the books buried in libraries for the scholars to find it. It's not hidden behind a microscope for the scientists. It's right there in the street. And it calls us by name. And it's the very fact that it's so obvious, and it's the very fact that it's right there and it's not hidden, that makes it so easy to ignore. It's available to us. It's not that wisdom for any of these individuals was unavailable, but that they didn't avail themselves of the wisdom. What does the Bible say? If any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. He giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not. It's not that God doesn't give us wisdom, but that we don't want His wisdom. Look with me again at this proverb in verse 22. How long, ye simple ones, will you love simplicity? And the scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. It's not that the knowledge wasn't there. They didn't want the knowledge. They hated it. And how many times do we do that? We know what we're going to do is foolish. We know what we're about to do is wrong. We know the message we're ignoring could save our souls, but we ignore it. We hate knowledge. Look at the call of wisdom again in verse 22. How long, ye simple ones, will you love simplicity? And the scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Turn you at my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit unto you, and I will make known my words unto you. If the little boy would just turn back to his mother, she would gladly explain to him why he shouldn't walk into the street. If that man would sit there and think about it for a moment, he could probably come up with a few reasons why he shouldn't respond in anger. And if that woman would just listen carefully and consider the gospel, she would find it to be perfectly reasonable and true. Wisdom isn't hiding, and wisdom isn't speaking in riddles. You just have to turn, and you have to listen. We see the call of wisdom, but look at the laugh of wisdom beginning in verse 24. Because I've called and you refused, I stretched out my hand and no man regarded. But ye have said it not all my counsel and would none of my reproof. I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your fear cometh. And the voice of wisdom that said, look out, now says, I told you so. When your fear cometh as a desolation, and your destruction cometh as a whirlwind, when distress and anguish cometh upon you, then they shall call upon me, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. For that they hated knowledge, and they did not choose the fear of the Lord. They wish they could go back. They face the consequences, and they wish they could go back. The little boy waiting for the doctor to tell him how permanent the damage is would give anything to go back. The man sitting in the police station obviously wishes he could undo what he just did. And for all of them and for the woman, it's too late. It's too late. But what is it that pushes them over the edge? Look at verse 31. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their own way and be filled with their own devices. For the turning away of the simple shall slay them, and the prosperity of fools shall destroy them. What was it that pushed them over the edge? It was that feeling of confidence in the little boy right before his foot slipped. It was that pulse of adrenaline in that man's veins right before the cuff was slapped on his wrist. And it's that little feeling of pride that that woman felt when she walked away from the sermon thinking, that's nice, but it's for somebody else. That prosperity of the wicked is their destruction. That turning of the simple is exactly what slays them. Think about what they would have given up if they would have listened to wisdom. It wouldn't have been as fun for the little boy to walk away from the street and go back to his mom. It would have been a little humiliating for the husband to say, you know what, honey, you're right. I'm not in any state to talk to anybody right now. I'm just going to calm down. And it would have been hard for the woman to kneel there at her chair and accept Jesus Christ, or yet to go to the pastor and ask him to explain it again. It would have cost something. But any of those three individuals would tell you it would have been worth it. It would have been worth it. Look at the consequences of the fool. He's destroyed. But look at verse 33. But whoso hearkeneth unto me shall dwell safely, and shall be quiet from fear of evil. Wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord, and it goes from there. I understand something and believe something to be true about God. I fear God, and so I'm going to live in that fear. That's what wisdom is. I understand that God is holy. I understand that He's just. I understand that He's loving. I understand the attributes, the perfections, the characteristics of God, and then I live accordingly. So if I understand the holiness of God, I see how sinful I really am. When I understand the justice of God, I realize that I am in deep trouble. When I understand the love of God and that He loved the world in this way, that He sent His only begotten Son to die on a cross, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, then I have no choice but to run to God and to embrace His love and to run to the gospel to be saved. But we don't fear God. When you fear God, you have nothing else to fear. Look at verse 33. Whoso hearkeneth unto me shall dwell safely and shall be quiet from fear of evil. It was the first song we sang this morning. Talked about how we're protected by God. That's exactly what that's talking about. If we fear God, we have nothing else to fear. If we don't fear God, we have everything else to fear. The fool is destroyed. The wise is very secure. I don't know which of these stories maybe you identify with, if any of them. Maybe you're about to do something really stupid. Just listen to wisdom. Maybe you're about to do something or are doing something that is really wrong. Listen to wisdom. And maybe you're about to ignore a message that could save your soul. Listen to wisdom. It's not hiding from you. It's not hiding from me. It's right there. Sunday school this morning, we talked about answering the question, what happens to those who never hear the gospel? The answer is, how can they call upon Him whom they have not believed? How shall they believe on Him whom they have not heard? How shall they hear without a preacher? It's you and me. We're the preachers. But in that song we just sang, it reminded us of something. We may be telling them, but many times people turn away. Wisdom is right there calling to people. It's calling to you, telling you, don't do that foolish thing. Telling you, don't walk into that sin. Don't touch that. Don't drink that. Don't click on that. And it's right there. It's not hiding. But we've grown to ignore it because His voice is so familiar. It doesn't come to us with glittering sparkles and some dynamic voice. It's in an ordinary, commonplace. The voice of a mother, the voice of a wife, the voice of that old preacher. Common things that are so easy to overlook. And that's where wisdom is. But how long will we ignore wisdom? How long will we ignore wisdom? We mentioned at the beginning of the message that Solomon is the one who wrote this, the wisest man that ever lived, and perhaps one of the most foolish. God gave him an amazing amount of wisdom, and wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord, and yet he worshipped so many other gods. It begins with the fear of the Lord, and yet he had so many wives. How could someone so wise be so foolish? Because the voice of wisdom was calling in the street, and he ignored it. How many times do we do the same thing? We hear that voice, whether it's our own conscience, whether it's a pastor in a sermon, whether it's a loved one, whether it's someone at work we don't really want to listen to, but they give us wisdom. In youth group, we just looked at the Beatitudes, and one of those is meekness. And part of that includes listening to wisdom wherever it might come from, even if it is your mom, right, or your wife or somebody. It's often those most common voices. I just find it so easy to ignore them. Obviously, each of those situations, they're made up, but they're real. and they picture different things in our lives. I can think back on my life, and if you've been alive for any length of time, you can think back on times where you've ignored the voice of wisdom. We can look through Scripture and see times where people ignored the voice of wisdom. Over and over and over, they ignore the voice of wisdom, and eventually they end up eating the fruit of their way. They get exactly what they deserve. Their calamity comes upon them like a whirlwind, out of nowhere. That boy wasn't expecting anything to happen. He was going to get his coin. He didn't know what his mom was talking about. The street's fine. And obviously we look at that boy and think, why are you so foolish? But we do the same thing. We step out into traffic when it's obvious that's not the right thing to do. That man, we can sit here from our armchair and look at him and think, knucklehead, he should have just sat in the car. But how many times in the moment do we give in to sin? In so many different areas of our life. Whether it's saying something we shouldn't have said, doing something we shouldn't have done, letting our mind just fixate on something we know we shouldn't be thinking about. And we hear the voice of wisdom. It's right there. But all the noise of the street is too loud. And we don't listen. It's easy for people to say, well, I didn't know. But that's not true. They hated knowledge. The knowledge was there, it was available to them, and they ignored it. We think of Solomon. The knowledge was there, the wisdom was there. He wrote about it right here in this passage even, and he still ignored it. The man who wrote these words ignored the voice of wisdom. So it's not beyond any of us to ignore the voice of wisdom. So again, I don't know which of these stories you might identify with. Or maybe you are the voice of wisdom in someone else's life. Keep being that voice of wisdom. We need it. Those of us who need that voice of wisdom, that's all of us. We need the voice of wisdom. But listen to it before it's too late. For each of these individuals, there came a point of no return where it was too late. There was no turning back. Once that car hit the little boy, there's no going back. Once that man got into a fisticuffs with that driver, there's no going back. And once that woman was hit in that traffic accident, there's no going back. And that same voice that says, look out, stop, don't do that, believe this, now says, it's too late. I wish you would have listened too. The voice of wisdom is so easily ignored. So are you about to do something really stupid? Are you about to do something really wrong? Are you about to ignore something that could save your soul? Don't do it. Listen to the voice of wisdom. And that goes to me as well. It's so easy to ignore the voice of wisdom because it's right there in front of us. It's right there in front of us. Let's all stand. Dear Heavenly Father, I know it was a short message this morning, Lord, but I think it was an important one. I know it's one I needed. God, the voice of wisdom, oftentimes we think of wisdom as something deep, something secret, something hard to find, but you've made it so readily available to us. We just don't avail ourselves of it. God, we bury our heads in the sand. We allow the anger to overwhelm us. We allow the other voices to just drown out the voice of wisdom. In our homes, in our schools, in our workplaces, even in our church, Lord. And we ignore the voice of wisdom. God, I don't know the hearts of the people standing here, Lord. Maybe there's someone here this morning that's been doing something or is about to get into something that really just is foolish. God, I pray that you would give wisdom a new voice, Lord, that they would hear it again and that they would listen. Lord, maybe there's someone here who's involved in something or about to get involved with something that's really wrong. Lord, I pray that they would listen to the voice of wisdom even this morning. And they would get that right. And Father, maybe there's someone here this morning who's never believed the gospel, though they may have heard it 1,000,000 times. God, I pray they would listen. With your heads bowed and your eyes closed. I don't know where you're at. But I think all of us have ignored the voice of wisdom. And I think this is a good time for all of us to get that right with the Lord. He's called to us. He's given us what we need, and yet we've ignored Him. You do business with the Lord today. If you want to come down to the altar and pray, if you want to pray there in your chair, But let's get right with God and let's listen to the voice of wisdom.
Softly and tenderly